Today in church history, we talk about Abraham Kuyper as a journalist and as a politician. In two earlier segments, we talked about the early life of Abraham Kuyper, and we looked at how astonishingly the Lord converted him as a young preacher. And then we've also looked at his role in education and how he advocated for Christian day schools in the Netherlands and inspired also Dutch Reformed people who immigrated to the United States to start their own Christian day schools throughout the country. Today we turn to Abraham Kuyper as a journalist and as a politician. Now, the way in which Abraham Kuyper became influential as a politician was through his work as a journalist. A couple of years before he actually became a member of the parliament, he began his journalist work as an editor. And what an editorial pen he flourished for decades. Now that explains too, when you look at Abraham Kuyper's work, how his work can not always be systematic on a topic. Like you might say, what does Kuyper teach on this topic? You might find that in his occasional writings, he speaks to an issue over here in this book or in this paper, but it's not always systematized. Now, he can be a very systematic writer, and in some of his theological writings, he has books on theological encyclopedia, for example, that are very, very systematized. But he also was a journalist. And what's going on with a journalist? Well, with a journalist, his deadlines are constantly coming. There's always a need for new material. He became the editor of The Standard, a couple years before he became a politician. So he was a journalist. Now, that reminds me of G.K. Chesterton, who also was a journalist. Some people have said, well, why is it that G.K. Chesterton doesn't have a work that stands out as like his magnum opus? For example, with G.K. Chesterton, you can find that many of the books that have been published about him, he was a Roman Catholic journalist in Great Britain in the early part of the 20th century, are books like this. For example, here's Alarms and Discursions. And what it is, it's a book that's a compilation of many of his articles in different magazines. And then All is Grist, another example of his writings that are just all picked from his occasional writings and put together into a book and published. That was the case with G.K. Chesterton. Now, of course, with G.K. Chesterton, he did have some books that became more prominent, like Orthodoxy and Heretics. Here's an example of those two books, both bound in one volume here. Now, that was a more systematic work in some ways that has had a long influence. That G.K. Chesterton was an occasional writer doesn't mean that he didn't produce some classics. Like, I think The Napoleon of Notting Hill is my favorite. I think it's a classic. Other people think that The Man Who Is Thursday is somehow a classic. But anyhow, with Abraham Kuyper, we find the same thing going on. He's a journalist, and therefore he's constantly writing. Now, some of the works that we have from his hand are books that were made up of these more occasional writings, where he would decide that he would write a series of articles on a specific topic in one of his magazines. Here, for example, is one volume of Pro Rege, which is literally for the king. Now, thankfully, in the last decade, there's been work on publishing Abraham Kuyper's works in English. So here you now have, this is volume 2 of Pro Rege translated into English. And so Abraham Kuyper's works are being published in English, some of them for the first time, like his work on Common Grace. This the subtitle of Pro Rege is Living Under Christ the King. And so what you have is a sort of political theology, but it also is a lot more than just a political theology. Another series of articles that ended up in a book were his series of articles on Common Grace. Here I have the Dutch version, De Gemene Gratie is the 3-volume work on Common Grace, which is also now translated into English. In these works, he is partly trying to defend and justify his approach to politics and really his Christian worldview approach. We're going to see that there ends up being a big tension between Abraham Kuyper's emphasis on the one hand on the antithesis, where he's going to say between Christian political parties, for example, and unbelieving atheistic political parties, there's going to be a massive antithesis, an antagonism. There's going to be much differing principles. He's going to also, of course, do that in his approach to education. That's why he wants a free university. That's a Christian university, so that all the subjects can be done in terms of Christian principles. And so he's very antithetical, in fact, in a surprising way. But then on the other hand, he's trying to encourage Dutch Reformed folk to be happy about the fact that Roman Catholics are joining him in a voting bloc. And so he uses the idea of common grace to justify there being common ground between, for example, Reformed believers and Roman Catholics on various topics. And he uses the idea of common grace for other purposes too. But let's talk about Abraham Kuyper as a politician. And not just as a politician, but his public theology. A motto that Abraham Kuyper had on the top of his magazine was a free church for a free state. It's kind of interesting that the grade school I went to in Edgerton, Minnesota was called the Free Christian School, playing off that fact that, once again, the school was free from state control. It wasn't a public government type run school. It was a parental run school. Now, that school also was free from the church as institute in the sense that parents ran it. But he says a free church for a free state. And the idea is that he doesn't want to have a state church. You see, that is the context in which he grew up in the Netherlands, in a context where the government basically had control and influence with respect to the state church. In fact, historically, the Dutch Reformed Church couldn't even call national synods to deal with problems and heresy in her midst, because the state would not allow that to be the case. So he wanted a free church. He wanted a properly pluralist society. In other words, he recognized the fact that in a society there would be people holding to different religious systems, and he didn't believe, for example, that Christians ought to domineer over other people from different religious backgrounds. Now, he also emphasized something that we call sphere sovereignty. And basically, when he would talk about what sphere sovereignty is, he would talk about the sovereignty of the triune God over the cosmos, but then he would apply it to different spheres of life, like government, the family, the business world, the sphere of education, and so on. But let's now go back and let's talk about his party that he started. What happened is that he ran across a man named Groen van Prinster, and this man was trying to get a more influential political party going that would stand for the ordinary Christians in the Netherlands, and that would protect, for example, Christian day schools. Well, the Anti-Revolutionary Party was the first truly national party in the Netherlands. So they didn't have as developed of a party system as was the case in the United States by that time. It was defined, the name Anti-Revolutionary Party comes from a response to the French Revolution and the atheistic attitude of the French Revolution, of course, all the chaos and violence unleashed by it. It was organized by Kuyper in 1879. And this party affirmed God's authority over the entire creation, including civil government. McGoldrick writes that it did not seek a theocracy, but a separation of church and state into distinct, but not alien, spheres of authority. So this party respected the civil rights of non-Christians. It insisted, for example, nevertheless, that God's moral laws must be the basis for the government of the nation. When Kuyper entered the parliament in 1874, he became the leader of this party, and he brought into that office all the skills he had for communicating political concerns to the common people. He already had learned how, as a guy who had been a sort of pointy-headed intellectual, how to communicate to the common Christians in the Netherlands. and he presided over the enlargement of the electorate. Prior to his time, only a very, very small percentage of men could vote in the Netherlands. Reforms in 1887 that he pushed allowed males over the age of 23 who were householders or who paid a stipulated amount of tax could vote. Now, to us, that seems quite a limitation yet. But the result was that the electorate increased from 100,000 voters to 350,000 voters. And from 1888 to 1938, the coalition between Abraham Kuyper's party, the Reform Party, and the Roman Catholic coalition won most of the elections, although by small margins, and they never drew more than 55% of the vote. But it was just ordinary farmers and small-town workers beginning to vote that played a role in Abraham Kuyper's success in the anti-revolutionary party, and which also propelled him to become the prime minister in 1901 to 1905. Now, during his time as prime minister, he was able to get some positive things done, but also he faced labor unrest, and also the socialists bitterly attacked him, even though he had developed almost, in some sense, a Christian approach to socialism in a sort of limited way. Now let's talk about this whole matter of sphere sovereignty. It's so very important. Abraham Kuyper argued that God had appointed different authorities in different spheres. In other words, in the sphere of a prison, there's the warden who's the authority. In the sphere of the state, there's the governor. In the sphere of a certain court, there's a judge. Now, what is authority? It is the right to rule. And Kuyper understood this, as Christianity has, as a God-given right to rule. Since God is sovereign over everyone and everything, he alone has the right to set men in positions of authority. Of course, you find this idea in the Bible, where God is the one who takes Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, down from his throne when he wishes, and then replaces him back on his throne when he wishes as well. Kuyper taught that kings or prime ministers or presidents had limited authority. God alone and Christ have unlimited and unrivaled authority. And of course, that's why Christians have said, if the magistrate tells me to do something that's wrong, I must obey God rather than man. Kuyper argued that men are only allowed to rule over the very limited sphere that God has allotted to them. So, for example, even if you are a prime minister, that doesn't make you the ruler of the homes, the families within the country that you rule. No, you have a limited sphere of authority. He said, no one is entitled to rule absolutely, for that is a divine prerogative alone. Now, you can see how this is something that we need to hear today as well, because the 20th century has seen the rise of communist governments in which they have claimed that they have the right to say and teach whatever they wish. And in communist governments, they have claimed that they have the right to rule absolutely. They have the right to tell, for example, that churches may not meet, or that Christians may not take their children to church, for example. And we found that also in Adolf Hitler. He thought that he somehow had the right to rule absolutely, to do whatever he wished within his domains. And the result of that attitude in the 20th century has been war and bloodshed on a scale that the world has never seen. So Abraham Kuyper, prior to this bloody century, is teaching these things. He says that God has instituted different authorities in family, in church, in state, in school, and the work world. So, for example, in the church, God governs through his elders. In the state, by president, senators, representatives, etc. In the workaday world, through your employer. And he says those who govern in such spheres are accountable to God in their exercise of authority. And that's something, of course, the Bible teaches. Jesus, or the Apostle Paul, warns, for example, masters about how they are overseeing their servants because they are accountable to Christ. Kings in the Bible are accountable to God. And so Kuyper taught that the sovereignty of the triune God is the source of all authority among men. people in positions of authority do not have the right to rule due to a supposed social contract, as Rousseau had claimed. Instead, the church, state, and family are of divine origin and must obey God's laws. Kuyper taught that the state must not try to be neutral towards God, but must recognize his supremacy over the civil sphere of authority. Even in the United States, we have statements like one nation under God. He said that Christ possesses all authority in heaven and on earth, so he is Lord over the state as well as the church. So notice that Kuyper is emphasizing the supremacy of the Son of God over the state. Now, he emphasized that in his reign of power, the Son of God reigns and rules over all states and all governments. Now, it's true that he also has a rule of grace, and in that rule of grace, he reigns over his covenant people and his people no matter what sphere they are in. The doctrine of sphere sovereignty is very important, you see, because it protects authorities in one sphere from illegitimate encroachment on the part of authorities who have limited authority in a different sphere. And of course, in the 20th century, we've seen that it's the state that tries to push themselves into the church. For example, like the communist government in China, for example, has tried to claim that, the only legitimate churches are the three state-approved churches. And there the state says that the churches may not preach, for example, the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Abraham Kuyper was very antithetical. In fact, he emphasized the antithesis and the fact that there were mutually exclusive worldviews. In other words, the Christian worldview is going to be over against a pagan worldview. In fact, he emphasized that there are mutually exclusive assumptions that are made on the part of an atheist. For example, an atheist has his assumptions about that there is not a God, assumptions about origins, a naturalistic philosophy, an evolutionary approach to understanding, for example, the origin of humans and the origin of human language. On the other hand, Christians are going to have also their assumptions about the nature of God, God as creator, and the origins of language, for example. And so he said there's no science that's actually like impartial. There is no discipline of learning where somehow everything that's laid out is just purely objective. And therefore, he says there are going to be disagreements about the interpretation of facts, for example. In other words, he is early on, before some philosophers of science in the middle part of the 20th century are going to see that there are not like these brute facts out there in the scientific endeavor, but there are facts, as Thomas Kuhn argues, that fit into a specific paradigm, and it's the paradigm that shapes an understanding of the nature of the fact and how it is to be interpreted. Kuyper was clearly seeing those sort of things. He was dealing with modernists who were basically engaging in synthesis. You see, they were trying to take whatever the pagan society was teaching, whatever Darwinism was teaching, and then trying to make it compatible with Christianity, as if there could not be any conflict or disagreement between Christianity and paganism. And he said, no, there is an impassable gulf between God and Satan, he says, between Christ and Antichrist. And so he argued that Christians should fight and struggle and argue and engage in polemics in every area of life and in every area of the curriculum in a school. He affirmed the antithesis. He said that it operates in every sphere, in every sensation of the heart, in every tissue of our thinking, in our antipathies and sympathies, in our entire world and life view, in the whole of our conception of the personal, familial, social, and political existence. So he is seeing this as a very wide-ranging thing. He says it exists in our jurisprudence and in our pedagogy. In other words, he's saying your Christian assumptions or your atheistic assumptions are going to affect your approach to all these spheres. And of course, Kuyper is right. He emphasized that a theologian or a politician should place principle against principle. Now, that's something that he emphasized. At the Free University, he talked about how there were Reformed principles and that the Christian scientists and professors there should do their work in line with Reformed principles. Now, he also made some mistakes here because as time went on, it became clear that it wasn't so clear what these Reformed principles were, especially if these Reformed principles did not flow out of the confessions of the Reformed churches. What exactly were these principles? And that became a kind of vague thing, and they gave opportunity for professors as time went on to basically go their own directions. Abraham Kuyper was a Ventilian before Cornelius Ventil in his apologetics, in the sense that he perceived that both Christians and non-Christians have presuppositions. So he was in some sense a presuppositionalist. And so he was ahead of his time in perceiving that atheists had their presuppositions. Unbelievers also, he knew, exercise a type of faith, although it might be in Charles Darwin's theories. McGoldrick says, Dr. Kuyper maintained that all scientific inquiries begin with axioms of faith that scholars choose to believe are true. All people exercise a type of faith, even though it is not that saving faith that God imparts to his chosen people by special grace. McGoldrick goes on to write, there is no actual conflict, Kuyper contended, between faith and science. Genuine faith encourages science. But conflict arises because one group of inquirers affirms God's sovereign decrees as the basis for science, while the other explains the world in terms of deism, pantheism, or naturalism. Well, that brings us to our discussion of common grace. So on the one hand, Abraham Kuyper is marvelously antithetical, but now, on the other hand, we find a tension that he pushes forward an idea of common grace. Kuyper thought that God showed common grace, for example, in the sphere of education. Since the antithesis is evident in all disciplines, one might think that unbelievers would be incapable of discovering and appropriating truth. But that is not so, Kuyper thought. He says God bestows common grace upon humanity without regard to a person's spiritual condition, so even militant atheists may possess and employ scientific acumen or amazing artistic talent. We now turn to the topic of common grace, which we have mentioned already. Abraham Kuyper is famous for his writings and defense of common grace. Now, he thought that this doctrine was necessary to explain the actual nature of the fall. And he also thought it was necessary to talk about how there is commonality between Christians and non-Christians. Now, I think, of course, he is on the right path in this. It is true that God gives every good gift that every pagan person has. God is the source of every intellectual gift, every gift of engineering, or every artistic gift has its source in God and comes from his Holy Spirit. Now, the problem with Abraham Kuyper is that he keeps talking about this as a gift of common grace. He refers to this as grace. I think rather it's better to think about them as providential gifts. I think that grace, when the New Testament uses that word, is referring to the grace, the saving grace, the marvelous grace that is shown to God's people in Jesus Christ. But it's true that God does give also even to wicked people a sense, at times anyways, of natural law. And Abraham Kuyper is trying to affirm that fact that even pagans have a conscience and know whether something is right or wrong, even though, of course, many times pagans don't realize what natural law is so clearly teaching. And at times, McGoldrick says, he said that regenerate and unregenerate people could work together to fulfill the cultural mandate, but other times he stressed the antithesis so greatly that McGoldrick says that such cooperation appears unlikely, if not impossible. So there was the tension. Now, the problem, of course, is that some of Kuyper's successors, anytime they came across something that really wasn't biblical, but that they found from a pagan source, whether it was from evolutionary sources or from the source of liberal Christianity, they would bring in the claim, well, they are simply using common grace stuff, and they tried to justify their bringing into Christianity of these pagan ideas with common grace. Now, Kuyper even tried to relate the two to each other. He tried to relate, special grace and common grace. So he tries to relate the special grace that he knew that was only for God's people in Jesus Christ. In fact, he has a book called Particular Grace, in which he emphasizes that God's saving grace is particularly only for God's elect. He says, as the church spreads Christian teachings, those teachings enhance the effects of common grace. That is, the more influential special grace becomes, the more common grace will affect society. In this way, saving, although it reaches only the elect, promotes the development of true culture through common grace. The church should encourage such cultural growth without trying to rule in the domain of common grace. Now, I think there, once again, he's touching on something which is true, and that is this, that where there are many Christians who together acknowledge the allegiance of the Lord Jesus Christ, they are light, and they are salt, and they have a positive effect on the society around them. Abraham Kuyper was also going in the right direction of trying to say there's no sacred sphere and then a secular sphere like the Roman Catholic Church had taught. That, the sacred sphere is that of the church as institute, and the monasteries where the monks and the nuns withdraw from the world to be holy, and then there's the rest of the people out there who are the laity. They're living secular lifestyles. No, Kuyper, following Abraham Kuyper, said that all of life is sacred, and that the Christian, in whatever he does, in the business world, in his entertainment, whatever it might be, is to be done before the face of God. Now, what we take away from Kuyper positively are a number of things. One, we learn from him that yes, in our approach to politics, we should not be shy about saying that God is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That is not something that we are hearing right now in the American political scene. That Christ has all authority over heaven and earth. That is true, and that is biblical. Also, Kuyper is right. I think he was forward-looking in his approach to pluralism, saying that, yes, we're in a society where there are people of all different beliefs, and we need to make sure that we live with people who have other beliefs and worldviews. And also, he was a strong for democracy and voting in the ballot box. Also, he recognized the antithesis, and I think that's something very important. He understands that Christians should not just assume that, well, whatever pagans produce scientifically or in the humanities or in entertainment, because somehow the gifts to do that come from God, that somehow those things are all baptized and are somehow things that Christians can just use and take in. Fourth, even though his approach to common grace has all kinds of problems in it, in fact, there are devastating problems with the very origins of his theory in the nature of the fall of Adam and Eve, he is emphasizing, of course, that there are common gifts that are given to all men, and that's true. God gives gifts in his sovereign providence to all kinds of people, to wicked people as well. And we need to realize that the reason why any scientific discoveries happen is because of gifts that come from the Holy Spirit. I think probably last and most important is Kuyper's view of sphere sovereignty, how important it is to affirm that God reigns over the various spheres through those whom he has given authority to reign and to rule and have authority within that sphere. And that protects the church from encroachment from the state. It also protects the state from having a church, for example, trying to domineer over it, like can happen in a state church context. And it also protects the sphere of the family and also the sphere of the workaday world and the business world from encroachment from other spheres. Now, with this talk on Abraham Kuyper as a journalist and politician, we complete our three-part series on the life of Abraham Kuyper.